So, beginning of glycolysis, you start with a glucose molecule, right? And you have an enzyme called hexokinase. And kinase means you're adding a phosphate every time you see that. So how is it going to add a phosphate? It's going to use ATP and it's going to transfer one of the phosphate groups to the 6-carbon of glucose. See? So you go from glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. And the enzyme that catalyzes the reaction is hexokinase. And this is an irreversible step where you add a phosphate to the 6-carbon of glucose. Okay? Moving on. So you have glucose 6-phosphate, and you're going to isomerize to fructose 6-phosphate. So you're not changing anything besides position. You're just gonna switch some of the molecules around. But in this process, you're gonna open the chain of glucose. So right now it's a closed ring, right? You're gonna open it up, change it to fructose 6-phosphate, and then you're gonna close it back. And this is your new structure. See the difference? Here it's like a hexagon, and here it's like a pentagon. Still the same molecules though. Okay, and the enzyme that does this is phosphoglucose isomerase, from glucose 6-phosphate to fructose 6-phosphate. All right, let's keep going. So once you have fructose 6-phosphate, you're gonna wanna form fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So what do you think that means? From fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. What's the difference? This one just has 1 phosphate on the 6-carbon. This one has 2 phosphates, 1 on the 6-carbon, and 1 on the 1st-carbon. So what enzyme catalyzed this reaction? Phosphofructokinase 1, also known as PFK1. Its cofactor is Mg2+. Okay, and an easy way to remember what this enzyme does is by looking at the name. So we know kinase means what? It means to add a phosphate, right? Which we are, just like we did before with hexokinase. Now we're doing phosphofructokinase. So if you want to know how to understand the name of the enzymes and what they do, even if you can't memorize it, kinase means you're phosphorylating. The beginning of the enzyme's name is what you're phosphorylating. So this is fructose 6-phosphate, right? So you're phosphorylating a fructose with a phosphate. That's why it's phosphofructokinase. You're phosphorylating that. Hexokinase, you're phosphorylating a hexagonal structure, the glucose. Okay, that's just a way for you to remember. But let's keep going. So this step is another irreversible step. So far we have 2 irreversible steps. The hexokinase, where you add a phosphate, and PFK, where you add a phosphate. You have to know all the irreversible steps of glycolysis. And this is also the first committed step. So what does that actually mean? The first committed step means that you're now locked in to the pathway. And by that, I mean, if you go backwards, at this point, you can't say that you're fully locked in to the pathway of glycolysis. At this point, you can still go in multiple different fates and directions. Like glucose 6-phosphate can enter that pathway, go this way, go this way. But it's once you reach fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, catalyzed by the reaction PFK1, you're now locked into glycolysis and you will finish glycolysis. Okay. So, fructose 1,6-bisphosphate will be cleaved by aldolase into DAP and GAP. So you're gonna cut it like in half, and you're gonna form DAP and GAP. But really, it's GAP that continues glycolysis, not DAP. But the interesting part is you can convert DAP into GAP, so you have 2 GAPs continuing the pathway. And what converts DAP into GAP? If you remember from exam 1, we have an enzyme called TIM. Do you remember the TIM barrel protein? So TIM has an alpha-beta barrel structure. It's called trisphosphate isomerase. And basically, it's going to convert DAP into GAP. But in the process of doing this, you're going to have an intermediate that looks just like this. And it's called an anidiyl intermediate. And in case you want to know, when you go from DAP to gap, you're going from a ketone to an aldose. Ketone to aldose. Last thing you have to know about this step with trisphosphate isomerase is that it involves glutamate and histidine residues. Know that just in case. Okay. So once you have gap, you are going to go from gap to 1,3-BPG via the enzyme glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. There's a couple important things you have to know about this enzyme. So this enzyme right here, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, requires NAD+. That is very important. This step requires NAD+. Because later, you're going to need NAD+ being regenerated by lactate fermentation, and that regeneration will come back around to supply this step. Okay, so what does this enzyme actually do? This is very important as well. So the starting substrate in this reaction is GAP, right? So up here, you see a CHO, a CHO. You're gonna do a coupled reaction. So the first step is you're gonna take the CHO of GAP and you convert it to CO2. That's the first thing you do, and that's favorable. Going from CHO to CO2 is the oxidation, and that's favorable. You're using NAD+, like we said, to oxidize CHO to CO2. Once you form CO2, which was a favorable oxidation, you can now add an inorganic phosphate group, or phosphate, sorry, onto that new oxygen that you just formed. Because you went from H to an O, right, to make CO2. Now you can use that new O to put a phosphate on, right? So you added inorganic phosphate to CO2. That was unfavorable, but combining a favorable reaction with an unfavorable one, you were able to make 1,3-PPG. So main things you should know about this step is the enzyme name, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, needs NAD+ to do the oxidation in this coupled reaction to make CHO to CO2, and then CO2 add a phosphate on it. All right, now you have two phosphates, so it's 1,3-BPG. I don't know if this is important, but that step that we just went through, the coupling right here requires high energy thioester intermediate involving active site cysteine, cis-149. I'll memorize that residue just because he likes to add about amino acid residues a lot on his exams. Okay, moving on. So we just formed 1,3-PPG, right? That was the new phosphate that we just added. Now, you're gonna go from 1,3-BPG to 3-phosphoglycerate. But the main important part of this step is not really what we're forming. It's the fact that we're doing substrate level phosphorylation for the first time. So you know in glycolysis, we make ATP, right? You know ATP is a product of glycolysis. This is the step where you make ATP. There's two steps. This is the first time. So this is the first substrate level phosphorylation. So if you're asked what enzyme performs substrate level phosphorylation, you could say phosphoglycerate kinase. But you might be wondering, you thought kinase means phosphorylating, right? So if kinase means phosphorylating, why are we getting rid of this phosphate? Because you're going from 1,3-PPG just to 3-phosphoglycerate. So this phosphoglycerate kinase is actually transferring this phosphate to the ADP. So you're phosphorylating the ADP. Now you have ATP. So you're forming ATP for the first time via substrate. You're using the substrate to make ATP. We call it substrate level phosphorylation because there's other ways to make ATP. And you'll see that later in the electron transport chain. That's like the main way of making ATP. This is like very small. Okay, from 3-phosphoglycerate to 2-phosphoglycerate, you're gonna have an enzyme called phosphoglycerate mutase. And all you're doing is you're moving the phosphate from this 3 position up to the 2. See? But the cofactor for that is Mg2 plus. I'm mentioning cofactor. Everything I put here is something that's fair game, or that he said you have to know. You have to know all the irreversible steps. You have to know substrate phosphorylation. You have to know cofactors. You have to know basically just know anything here. It's not extra information. So Mg2 plus cofactor. Also, this enzyme employs active site phosphorhistidine residue. Just know that if you're asked what enzyme has this, it's phosphoglycerate mutase. Phosphoglycerate mutase employs active site phosphohistidine residue. Okay. Now we have 2-phosphoglycerate. You're gonna go from 2-phosphoglycerate to phosphoenolpyruvate, PEP. So the enzyme that catalyzes the reaction from 2-phosphoglycerate and forms PEP is enolase. And this is a dehydration reaction. This is the only dehydration reaction in the process. So if you were asked what enzyme performs dehydration, it's enolase. You should also know that fluoride inhibits enolase. Anyways, when you go from 2-phosphoglycerate and you form a PEP, what is the point of doing that? Do you remember that PEP from the last test unit is a high energy compound? And high energy compounds means that you really want to lose a phosphate. You're so ready to lose a phosphate. Like ATP is a high energy compound, right? Why? Because it's so ready to give up its P. That is energy, essentially. So this is a high energy compound, means unstable. It's ready to let that go. So you can see the dehydration reaction by enolase, the purpose was to elevate P group transfer potential. So now that you've formed this enol that is unstable, you are ready to let that phosphate go. And what do you think will happen now with that phosphate? You're gonna have the second substrate level phosphorylation. You're gonna use that phosphate on the enol that is so ready to go to put onto an ADP again to make ATP. So that's your second ATP that was made. Yeah, so PEP is unstable, it's an enol group, and you're gonna go to pyruvate, which is a ketone, which is more stable. The enzyme that does this is pyruvate kinase. Cofactors are Mg2 plus and K plus, and this is an irreversible step. So far, we had 3 irreversible steps, right? We had, let's see, the first step here, hexokinase, irreversible, glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. And then we had fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. The first committed step where you lock in, that's also irreversible. And then finally, the third irreversible step we just talked about, pyruvate kinase. Irreversible, 3 irreversible steps, must know. Okay, that's basically the end of glycolysis once you form pyruvate. But we're gonna do one more step just to show something. So in the presence of low O2, or I should say, when there's a low O2, you have lactic acid fermentation. So when O2 is low, the fate of pyruvate, because there's many fates it can have, is you will form lactate via lactate dehydrogenase. And this reaction of pyruvate to lactate by lactate dehydrogenase regenerates NAD+. And where do you think that NAD+ is going to go? Remember, we need NAD+ for glycolysis to work. So you need to regenerate it at some point. It's regenerated here in lactic acid fermentation. Where will NAD+ go back in the process to keep filling it? It will go all the way back to glycerolaldehyde, 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, remember, that needs NAD+ to do this coupling reaction. Okay, good. Just quick review. It might be hard to remember every step and where Mg2 plus is a cofactor. So I made a list right here. Mg2 plus is a cofactor in these 5 enzymes, in case he asks. But it's kind of easy. Ng2 plus is a cofactor in all the enzymes with a kinase in its name, and phosphoglycerate mutase. So just remember phosphoglycerate mutase and all the kinases. Make the list for enzymes that use Mg2 plus as a cofactor. The irreversible steps were hexokinase, phosphofructokinase 1, and pyruvate kinase. Know those three for sure.